Soul Train is still on the move.
Yes, sir.
And the fact that we're in the year 2020 means that God has not yet stopped the train. So encourage everyone you know to jump on board the Soul Train. You can bet your last money it's all going to be a stone gas, honey.
Yeah.
Last week as we got ready for church, I'm not sure what you were doing, but my mind just wandered across churches, what everyone was doing last Sunday as we were getting ready for church, making plans for what we would do after church, go to lunch, visit family. James, in chapter 4 of his book, he said, as you go about your life, don't just say, tomorrow I'll do this and next week I'll do that. He said, you should say, if it's God's will, we'll do this. If it's God's will, we'll do that. If it's God's will, we'll go here. If it's God's will, we'll go there. Last week, Breedlove and I discussed church security. And I remember him making the statement to me about strangers coming into the church and what we would do if there was danger in the church. And he said, you know, Roland, we are the church. We welcome everyone. All of society's derelicts, we welcome them in the church. And our discussion ended pretty much there. Then after church, Carolyn and I, as we were leaving the parking lot, she read me a report about the tragedy that befell our brethren at the West Side Church of Christ. No doubt, two of our brethren had plans for after church just like we did. Only their plans did not come to fruition. Please keep the family of those individuals and the West Side Church in your hearts and minds, as well as this church and every church. Who knew? And like many, I wonder why God allows things like that to happen. A lot of evil people in this world doing evil things who, God, you see what's going on over here, why not trip them up? But God never promised us an easy ride, did he?
That's right.
He never promised that we'd have sunshine every day. He said he allows his rain to fall on the just. You've read that passage too. This morning I want to talk about God being the covenant maker. And as God is the covenant maker, do not be the covenant breaker. You've no doubt heard about references to the New Covenant and the Old Covenant, New Testament and the Old Testament. A covenant is basically an agreement between two or more people. Those who have been married entered a covenant with someone. If you've purchased a vehicle, unless you laid cash down, and if you did, I want to talk to you after church. If you purchased the vehicle by way of a loan, you entered a covenant, an agreement with a financial institution. If you bought a house, you entered a covenant, an agreement with a financial institution. In the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28, the Bible speaks of God's covenant with mankind. And God's covenant was twofold in nature. It was a covenant of obedience, a covenant of blessing, and a covenant of cursing. It was twofold in nature. Yes, God promised to bless his children, but that blessing was based on their obedience. And he said, with the covenant of blessing, the covenant of blessing must come with obedience. If there's disobedience, then God said there's a covenant of cursing. God said, if you're obedient, I will bless your family, I will bless your employment. I'll bless your job situation. I will bless your finances. I will bless you so that when the enemy comes at you in one direction, they will flee from you in 7 directions. If you are obedient to me, God said, I will bless you. Deuteronomy chapter 28 says this, the Lord will make you the head and not the tail. He will always make you end up on top and not on bottom if you are obedient. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, as God speaks about the covenant of blessing and the covenant of cursing, the covenant of blessing is addressed in 13 verses. The covenant of cursing is addressed in 49 verses. Does God know something about his people? The covenant of blessing, he uses 13 verses. The covenant of cursing, 49 verses. God knows something about his people. He knows that his people have a tendency to be hard-headed. Have you ever tried to do something good for someone and they do everything they can to block you from doing something good for them? That was the nature of God's relationship with Israel. No matter what God tried to do for them, they got in the way. They got themselves in the way of God doing good in their lives. God wants to do so much good in the lives of his children. He wants to make his children the head and not the tail. He wants to make his children wind up on top and not on bottom. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 13, the apostle said, it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good purpose. Here's another translation of that same verse. God is working in you, giving you the desire to do his will and the power to do what pleases him. God has made it easy for us. Amen. All we have to do is be obedient to him. It is God who put in us the desire to please him and the power to carry it out. But somehow God's children manage to get in the way of him doing the good that he wants to do in our lives. Songwriter said, oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. God doesn't want us to go through that. But because of disobedience, remember, God is a covenant maker. Do not be the covenant breaker. This was a time when God was about to bring the children of Israel, the Israelites. And I prefer to say the Israelites because when we hear the children of Israel, think of little kids. These were grown folk. These were adults. They were stubborn, but they were adults. God is about to bring the Israelites into the promised land. But he said, before you go in there, before you fully occupy the land, there's some housekeeping that you've got to do. He wanted them to clean up in the land before they moved in. Sometimes when you move into a new house, you want to clean up, even though it may have been cleaned up before you got it. Well, that's just me. I'm just funny like that. Some people, when they travel, they carry Clorox and Clorox wipes and Lysol. I'm just funny like that. I want to clean up. I know maid's been in there and cleaned up, but I want to clean up for myself. I'm just funny like that. The Israelites, before they went into the land of promise, God said, you got some cleanup to do first. And the cleanup that God intended was this, Deuteronomy chapter 20. He said, in the cities and nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, go in there and do not leave alive anything that breathes. What's that, God? Kill everybody in the land. You see, the land of Canaan was wicked. Nobody in there care about God. God said, go in there and kill everybody. Now, that may seem kind of harsh. This loving God commanding his children to go in and kill everybody. Seems harsh, seems rough. But remember, God is a jealous God. And he doesn't like to share his glory with anybody. In the land of Canaan, there were many gods, false gods. The land was full of false worship. That's why God said, go in and kill everybody. Otherwise, verse 18, they will teach you to to follow the detestable ways of the ungodly, worshiping the gods of the heathen, and you will sin against the Lord your God. God did not want his people contaminated with the sin of the land. That's why I bring Clorox and Lysol with me when I go to that hotel room. You realize when you check into that hotel room that probably an hour before you jump in that bed, the honeymoon couple was in there. But I'll just leave it there. I like to clean up before going in. God said to this so that I don't get contaminated. God did not want his children contaminated when they went into the land. He said, kill everybody. Judges chapter 1. The Israelites entered the land of Canaan. Did they do what God said? Judges chapter 1 said disobedience took place right away. They did exactly what God said not to do. Now, God made the covenant. Israel broke the covenant. You ever make an agreement with someone and they break that agreement? It's offensive. We take it personally. Judges chapter 2, the Bible says this. God is talking to the Israelites. I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land of promise. I said I will never break my covenant as long as you are obedient. God is faithful. Amen. He's going to keep his part of the deal. He said, I will never break my covenant as long as you are faithful. Yet you have disobeyed me. I've also said, now because you've disobeyed me, I will not drive those wicked folk out of the land. They will become a trap for you because of your disobedience. Why is it necessary for God to beg his children to do what's right? God presented them. He said, I present you with blessing and cursing. Choose blessing. I present you with life and death. Choose life. Yeah. Amen. Time after time, God's children choose cursing. Time after time, God's children choose death. Yeah. When man does not do what God says to do, there are consequences. When man breaks covenant with God, man has lost God's protection, man has lost God's provision, and man has lost God's providential care. What is God's providential care? That's God looking out for us. We don't know what's in the future. We don't know the dangers that are ahead of us, but God takes care of us through his providential care. Disobedience gets in the middle of all that and disrupts all of it so that God draws back from the children he loves. Disobedience for material gain is a trap and a snare set by the devil. Disobedience for material gain is a trap and a snare set by the devil. And many of God's children are caught up in disobedience for material gain. I can't give all to the Lord right now because I got to spend my time working in order to gain materially. I can't give all my time to the Lord right now because I'm busy doing this, that, and the other to advance my material situation. Disobedience for material gain is a trap set by the devil. It's a snare. The Israelites fell into that trap, and they were a terrible failure when it came to obeying God's law. God said, I will never break my covenant with you, and he kept that promise. But the Israelites, they were covenant breakers. When any of the parties involved in a covenant or in an agreement violate any of the conditions of that agreement, the other party is no longer obligated to keep the agreement. So when man violates God's covenant, when man violates the agreement, God is no longer obligated to keep the agreement, and he does not. God promises of blessing are no longer valid when man disobeys his will, when man breaks the covenant. Over and over again, God has proven himself to be faithful in covenant keeping, to be the covenant maker. Over and over again, man has proven himself to be the covenant breaker. Yeah. And when man breaks covenant with God, you know what God calls it? Adultery. Yes. Adultery. We were in a relationship with God, broke off that relationship and began a relationship with someone or something else. God calls it adultery. Either our covenant is with God or it's with Satan. Can't be both. Either our covenant is with God or it's with Satan. Someone said, I would never make a covenant with Satan. That's easy to say. But when we choose to disobey God, we have chosen to make a covenant with Satan. Well, someone said, I disobeyed God yesterday. I disobeyed God this morning. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about making a choice to live a lifestyle that's contrary to what thus saith the Lord. Anyone who chooses that has broken covenant with God. And we are either with God or we are against him. There's no in between. Yes. Remember Joshua? Yeah. Choose this day who you're going to serve. As for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. Yeah. Elijah said the same thing. How long are you going to go back and forth between two opinions? If Baal, that was the heathen god, if Baal is God, serve him. But if Jehovah is God, then serve him. Revelation chapter 3, Jesus said the same thing. He said, if you're going to follow the devil, then follow him. But if you're going to follow me, then follow me. Either we are with God in a covenant or we are with the devil. There's no in between. And we would all find it offensive to say, I would never make a covenant with the devil. Disobedience, a lifestyle of choosing to reject God, to neglect God, is a choice to engage in a covenant with the devil. The danger of Israel's faithfulness and their loyalty to God came when they began to interact with the wicked Canaanites. You know, the one who God said, kill all of them. They disobeyed God and instead started to hang around the Canaanites. If we surround ourselves with godly people, we begin to walk godly. Yeah. We begin to talk godly. Yeah. We begin to think godly. We begin to act godly. Mm-hmm. But if we surround ourselves with ungodly people, we're going to walk like ungodly people. We're going to talk like ungodly people. We're going to think like ungodly people. Even if we come to church every now and then, we're going to live like ungodly people. We're going to act like ungodly people. James put it this way, chapter 4 of his book. You adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? And he says it again, if you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. Yeah. Someone says, I ain't a friend of the world. I'm a friend of God. You know, because that relationship I got with him on Sunday, maybe on Wednesday. Friendship with the world means that someone or something other than God gets more of me than God does. Friendship with the world means someone or something gets more of my time than God does. Yeah. Friendship with the world means that someone or something gets more of my money than God does. Someone or something gets more of everything that I am than God does. That's what it means to be friends with the world. And James calls that adultery. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15. Do not love the world or anything in the world. Why, John? Because if you love the world, he said, anyone who loves the world, the love of the Father is not in them. So what's it mean to love the world? It means to give more of me to anything or anyone than I give to God. Do the math for your own life. Who gets more of you, God or the stuff in the world? God or someone in the world? If you make alliances with this people, God said to Israel, you will no longer have the power to cast them out. See how God works? If we wrap ourselves around the world too tight, we will no longer have God's power, God's ability to resist all the temptation that Satan will throw our way. Yeah. And that's a choice, to wrap ourselves around the world. If we choose to make the world our friend, we've chosen to make God our enemy. Remember, God's instruction was to destroy all the Canaanites. And what did the Israelites do? They started singing and dancing with the Canaanites. Why did God say destroy all the Canaanites? Because he knew the Canaanites would corrupt the hearts and minds of his children. That's what the world does. And the devil is real subtle about this. How much evil does it take to destroy a whole lot of good? You got a whole lot of good over here and just a little bit of evil. How much evil does it take to destroy all that good? Very little. You've heard it. One bad apple will make all of them rotten. You got one bad apple over here and 100 good apples here. Take that one bad apple and drop it in the middle of that 100. And that one rotten apple is going to impact all the apples that it's in contact with. It's going to make all of them rotten. Let's say it's touching 5 apples. It's going to make all 5 of those apples rotten. Then those 5 rotten apples are going to impact all the rest of the apples. What's 5 times 5? 25. And so on and so on. I'm stopping there because my math ain't no good. I don't want to embarrass myself. With all the good in our hearts, it takes very little evil to destroy all that good. Out of 100 believers, how many does it take to corrupt and destroy? 1. All it takes is 1. And you would think that all the good would overcome 1 bad. Doesn't work that way. The devil is strong. He's been at it for a long, long time. If the 100 are not fully relying on God's strength through his precious Holy Spirit, they are in deep, deep trouble. Satan's influence is everywhere. His power is all over the nations of the earth. Jesus in John chapter 14 called him the ruler of this world. Here's how Satan works. He can influence us in such a way that we're not even aware that we are being influenced to do evil. That's how Satan works. Here's a new word I learned last week. He is insidious. Every time I learn a new word, I got to share it with you. That means he works gradually and in a subtle way. That means he's sneaky, but very, very harmful. Yes, insidious, that's the word. That's the way Satan works. Dude is sneaky. So that we may not even realize how much he's corrupting us. Satan knows better. I shared with the Bible class this morning. I've never drank, I've never got high, I've never done those things. Don't mean I'm a saint. Trust me, I got a truckload of issues. So Satan knows he can't tempt me with this can of beer. He can't tempt me with this dope. Not even close. I won't even look. Oh, but he knows all this other stuff where he can get my attention.
Yeah.
And he uses that in an insidious way, in a sneaky way, so that we may not even realize. Remember Eve in the garden?
Yeah.
That's what he did. What did God say? You can eat from all these trees in the garden, all of them. Just leave this one alone. What was so hard to understand about that? And here comes old Satan. Did God really say you can't touch that tree? And she should have said, yeah. I was going to say, heck yeah. Yes, he said that. Work with me, y'all. Work with me. That's what I would have said. Yeah, that's what he said. So Satan starts to work her now. He said, no, that's not what he really meant. And he worked in such a subtle, sneaky way that even though she loved God and knew what God said to do, he worked her and worked her husband to the point that they did exactly what God said not to do. Remember, this little dude running around with a pitchfork and a pointy tail, that ain't it. Satan knows he couldn't roll up in here and get our attention with that. But he knows how he can get your attention and yours and yours and yours and yours and mine. He knows our inclinations. He knows what we like. And he works in a very sneaky and subtle way to draw us away and get us to break covenant with God. He knows how to make evil look good and how to make good look evil. Just as Eve was deceived, God's children today can be deceived. See somebody do something foolish in the world and somebody says, that fool is just crazy. That fool was impacted by Satan. You and I have seen good people do some wicked things because they were impacted by Satan. He plants misinformation in our minds and in our hearts. He plants false, inaccurate information that's deliberately intended to deceive and to mislead. He affects the attitudes of those who love the Lord so that instead of being selfless and putting God first and putting others next, we become selfish and put ourselves first. That's what sin is all about, isn't it? Yeah. Sin is about pleasing this person we look at in the mirror every day. Yeah, I know what you said, God, but it's all about me. Now, we wouldn't say that because we ain't crazy. But our behavior shows God that we are more important than him. That's why our homecoming theme this year, not my will, but thine. That's easy to say. Something completely different to carry out. Is it wrong to look out for ourselves? Is it wrong to take care of ourselves? No. But what's wrong is making pleasing ourselves more important than pleasing God. Yeah. Remember the Pharisees that tried to trip up Jesus? What's the greatest commandment, Jesus? Had about 600 some commandments in the Old Testament. Which one's the greatest, Jesus? Jesus said what? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And he said, by the way, the second one is just like it. Love your neighbor. And not just love him, but love him like you love this person right here. I'm still working on that one. It's difficult. Some folk are unlovable, ain't they? But guess who was that way and Jesus loved us anyway? Satan won't tell you about the danger and the wickedness involved in bad choices. See, that's in the fine print. Brothers and sisters, we've got to read the fine print. All Satan will tell you is what a good time you're fixing to have. He won't let you know disaster is waiting down the end of that road. God is a covenant maker. Do not be a covenant breaker. We have got to be careful not to allow ourselves to take the devil lightly, because then we'll be certain to break covenant with God. That's why the apostle said, whatsoever is pure, whatsoever is good, whatsoever is holy, whatsoever is right, think on these things. Somebody said an idle mind is the devil's workshop. You ain't got nothing going on in there for Jesus. Guess what? Guess who's going to show up? And he ain't going to knock. He's going to come right and he will occupy and take over. Man wants to keep his evil desires thinking he can control them. Man is funny that way. Well, keep his desires he shall, but control them he shall not. Those evil desires will cause God's children to break covenant, just as the Israelites did. God is the covenant maker. Do not be the covenant breaker.